Good to be here. The Heartland Institute's a great organization, and I'll just second the suggestion that if you happen to be very successful in whatever line of work you're in, write them a nice big check. The big question, I think, for anyone who's at all politically active, is, I'm going to skip over my own bio because I don't want to waste too much time, is what is the nature of the current crisis the country is in? I think there's no doubt we're in a pretty miserable period. This Obamacare rollout is almost like a parable from something from Frederick Hayek about why you can't run a sixth of the economy from a desk in Washington as if you were a Soviet commissar. Yet they tried it, and they're doing incredibly ruinous things to us. And there's lots of other problems. The regulatory burden on the country is difficult to calculate, but it's many trillions of dollars. The total obligations that the federal government has undertaken, including the unfunded ones and insuring things they shouldn't be insuring, it's something like $130 trillion. And we also have, of course, state, county, and municipal obligations that are unfunded or unpayable. So we're on the edge of a cliff. So are we kind of the people at the Alamo dying for our principles and then we're finished, or are we in a period of transition to something better? In large measure, that turns on what we do to seize the day and make the future that we want happen. But I think that the general direction we're going in is to basically dissolve the existing welfare apparatus, the legacy state of the 20th century, and replace it with something better. It's failing by itself. It's going to go away one way or the other because it's running out of money. So it's what do we put in its place, and do we present a vision of the future to motivate people to build something better? And one reason we should be hopeful is we already have been through a very major shift in American life. And I'll explain our nomenclature for a moment. We talk about America 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. America 1.0 is the America of the founding era: muscle power, animal power, small-scale local government, small enterprises. Most people lived and worked on family farms or family-scale businesses, or owned them or worked for them. The very large enterprises didn't come along till later. America 2.0 was the age of machine power, and I'll speak a little bit more about these in a minute. But we did make this transition on the scale I think we're going into. The technological changes coming are on the scale of the introduction of steam power and mechanical power, that big. And if that's right, we've done it once. So we should be hopeful we can do it again. America 2.0, the world that we grew up in, was the world of large organizations. It was hierarchic. It was centrally directed. The first really big enterprises were the railroads. You had to run them centrally. You had to have someone in a telegraph office make sure the trains all were in the right place at the right time, or you'd have a crash and kill a lot of people, okay? And the guys who built that system were veterans of the American Civil War. And they had seen a gigantic government direct an enormous effort on a scale no one dreamed was possible successfully. So that generation that built the progressive era America, industrial America, had a lot of faith in that type of organization. Of course, the assembly line and mass production, the factory economy of the 20th century was along the same lines. You needed to have lots of people doing things in a systematic way. They couldn't be kind of voluntarily networked. They didn't have the internet. You had to have thousands of guys show up at the plant, work in a shift, work according to a sort of systematic Taylorite, for those of you who know the word, plan, and you could get huge returns on this. But of course, people sacrificed a lot of autonomy. The move from a free but poor agricultural country to a relatively wealthy but very disciplined, organized, and top-down American society was a huge change. And that's the world that many of us grew up in, and that's sort of falling apart at this point. The 2.0 era too, the transition period was very difficult because you had people who were driven off of the old way of life and into the big cities. Frequently, it was tough. If there was an economic downturn, there was no safety net. They played by the rules, but there was nothing for them. And that led to the rise of a mass political movement. And also, we had labor unrest. Here we are in Chicago, the city of the, we had riots. We had the Haymarket riot with the bombing. One reason the federal government has a naval base and a military base north of the city is the prospect that Chicago would have been like the Paris Commune, and we'd have a communist government take over here. They were seriously thinking about this. So that's how bad things were. People were thinking at that time in the late 19th century, we're going to lose our Constitution, we're going to lose everything. We have to make some very major change in American life to save ourselves. And ultimately, over a generation or two, and we're going to get some boos at the Heartland Institute for Franklin Roosevelt, yeah, okay, hiss for, yeah, very good, for Franklin Roosevelt. But the progressive movement took a couple of generations to ultimately take over the U.S. government and install the New Deal arrangements that basically we live under now. And that, in their day, were relatively successful. You know, it was a big unit America that won the Second World War. Big labor, big government, and big business worked in tandem, worked hand in hand. It was a corporatist model. And, you know, we were the arsenal of democracy. I think the greatest achievement of that America was our military success in World War II. We built tens of thousands of aircraft, thousands of ships, and moved millions of men overseas and armed and fed them and defeated, you know, one of the great evils in the history of the world. I mean, in 1,000 years when they write about the USA, that's going to be our, you know, heroic moment. That's our Iliad, right? So that was the great achievement of America in that period. And the big institutions in American life had a lot of prestige after the Second World War. People really believed the government could take on big projects and do them well, with some reason. And, you know, Eisenhower brought the Republicans back to power and really didn't touch the core of the New Deal. He tried to kind of make it a little more reasonable, not waste money, but he was also a guy who undertook very big projects like the interstate highway system and so on. So the period after the Second World War is in a way the kind of peak and culmination of America 2.0. And it was a pretty good time. Millions of people were able to buy their own homes and move out to the suburbs and be employed in the large enterprises of the day with a certain amount of hope and belief that the safety net would work, that their retirement would be taken care of, and that things would carry on pretty much as they had been. Now, you would think then, well, perhaps, you know, why is it that we didn't just kind of stay on that path, that the government continued to be a very powerful, very influential factor, and go into almost full-scale socialism, or at least to the degree that people did in Western Europe? And what ended up happening is we started to, you know, develop we started to have some crises of the regime. We also started to see some new developments happen that were the kind of the foundational components of the economy that we believe is coming. The Vietnam War and the Great Society were both huge efforts by the kind of blue model welfare state that both were failures. And we also started to see the beginning of the internet, the DARPANET, and the beginning of personal computing, which I think is to the coming economy what the steam engines and railroads of America 2.0 were to that previous economy, the foundational technological change. Now, if this current model is failing, we need to have a, you know, a vision of the future. We need to have some clarity about our past, and we need facts and, you know, facts that give rise to hope about how things are going to go, which is really the point of our book. We go back about 1,500 years and we go forward about 40 years, try to fill it all in. And of course, we don't have the last word about where the future is going to be. We hopefully have the first word about where the future is going to be. One of the problems you have when you speak to conservatives is you say, imagine that we win some elections in 2, 4, 6, 8 years, get people elected whom we like, and policies enacted that we like. What's the country going to look like? What's the world going to be like that our kids and grandkids are going to live in? And they usually don't have an answer. They tend to be nostalgic for a kind of romanticized vision of America 1.0. And, you know, if you ask a liberal, progressive, whatever they call themselves these days, where things are going, it's basically doubling down on the welfare state approach. It's kind of a Roosevelt New Deal. It's completing Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and having a safety net that's paid for by taxing whoever they deem the rich to be to take care of everybody's needs. That's not going to work either. It's interesting, I'm speaking to at a libertarian organization. Libertarians tend to actually be pretty forward-looking. They like science fiction, they like Ayn Rand. The world they want to live in hasn't happened yet, and so they're a little more open to the idea that there's possibilities of something different and something better coming along. So what is the basis in the book for the idea that we should be reasonably hopeful? And am I getting out of step with my slides? Yeah, I think I am. Hang on. Yeah, it's the U-turn. I'll skip that one. The key things we focus on are the underlying cultural foundations of the United States and the changing technology that's coming. And the family structure of the USA is something even people who talk about family values aren't terribly familiar with. There is a anthropological term to describe what we have here. It's the absolute nuclear family. Anyone raise your hand if you've ever heard this expression before, except from me. This young lady has. Okay, a couple of people. The absolute nuclear family is different from most types of families in the world. People pick their own spouses. Their parents don't do it for them. People are not can't demand any particular inheritance from their parents, and their parents aren't bound to give them anything. They choose their own spouses. They are expected to leave the home and start their own home somewhere and pursue their own careers independently. They don't belong to extended family networks that take care of you and that impose obligations on you. It's the most individualistic type of family structure in the world, and it goes back very, very far into English and then American history. There's two writers whom we draw on in the book, Alan McFarlane and Emmanuel Todd. Alan McFarlane's a fascinating guy. We've had the good fortune to sort of strike up a conversation with him, my co-author and I. In the 70s, Alan McFarlane was researching what he'd been taught in the university, that under the Marxist theory of history, at some point in the early modern period, there was a transition in England to a capitalist mindset, that people used to be communal and share everything and do everything collectively. And then at some point, this kind of evil capitalist economy came in and turned everything into a cash transaction, and then they became individualistic. So England, one of the few countries in the world that's been spared conquest and destruction, has lots of records going way, way back. And Alan's doing his research, and he goes back and is reading all these legal records and diaries, and there was no transition. The English have been individualistic, capitalistic, money-directed, not peasants who are tied to the land as far back as we have written records, and we have every reason to think they were even farther back than that. This is a unique feature to the English approach. And you see here on this map, there's the yellow portion of the sort of eastern portion of the island of Britain, a little bit of Holland, and a little bit of Denmark and Scandinavia are the only places where you have this absolute nuclear family. And from this sort of seedbed, it's spread around to the entire rest of the English-speaking world. And everyone who's migrated here has been forced to adopt it. If you come from a country where your family picks who your daughters are going to marry, you can't do it here, at least not past the first generation. If you've come from a place where it's really demanded that you leave all your inheritance to your oldest son, you can't enforce it here. Our courts won't do it. People have picked up the English language, and they've also picked up this English-derived absolute nuclear family type mindset. It makes people more individualistic, freedom-loving, enterprising than people in other societies. And what I usually have people say to me here is, but we used to be like that, but we're not anymore. We may be less like that than we once were, but the survey data shows we're far more like that than almost everybody else in the world. America is still, by comparison, the most individualistic, liberty-minded compared to equality-minded and enterprising people in the world, with very few exceptions. So that's the foundation, that's the cultural foundation that makes us think we're still going to, we still have what it's going to take advantage of these changes and be a free and open and prosperous society in the future. Of course, we also got from our English ancestors, none of whom I actually have. We're all in this room speaking English. Anyone here, raise your hand if you have English ancestors. About half? Okay. But the rest of us don't, right? Yet, here we are. And the institutional inheritance we all know, we have the Magna Carta, the rule of law, due process as an expectation, right? The government can't arbitrarily do things to you. They have to play by the rules. The Bill of Rights of 1689, not as many people know it. my friend Dan back there knows there was all kinds of stuff directed against Catholics in that. But the basic idea of the freedoms that people had, like the right to keep and bear arms, for example, or to be secure in their papers and their persons and so on, we inherited. And we eventually, in the USA, managed to expunge the religious bigotry from the thing as we proceeded. And the American founding documents are really based on English precedents. I mean, the Bill of Rights of 1689 has language, some of which is word for word the same as in the American Bill of Rights. Now, the third founding document I have on here is the Northwest Ordinance, and people may remember it from high school, but it maybe didn't sink in how important it really was. The Northwest Ordinance governed these states that we think of as the Midwest. And it's interesting, when they were making a law to govern everything west of the Appalachians, they were going to have a provision that slavery was forbidden. And it lost by 1 vote. So always vote. Thomas Jefferson had in his diary this evil, this was like the hand of God came forward and then was drawn back at the last second. But they did manage to get a deal where, at least north of the Ohio River, there'd be no slavery. That was a compromise deal they struck, okay? And it's interesting what they ended up doing was carving everything up into sort of right-angle counties and even right-angle shaped states, except where they follow rivers. And the basic unit was a 160-acre lot, which was enough for one single family to own and operate a farm with the technology of the day. The absolute nuclear family created the framework for the whole rest of the settlement of the country all the way out to the West Coast. And that's kind of been that was the embodiment of the America 1.0. That was the embodiment of what people really wanted, what the American people and the other people like them really want is enough to take care of themselves and their family and to do everything else by voluntary association. One of the questions people from other societies would have is, how do these people get anything done if they don't have cousins and uncles and everybody to take care of them? It's like, we actually choose who we're going to deal with and associate with. We got the kind of a rainbow coalition right in this room, right? We're here because we were interested in these ideas. And we work with other co-workers, most of whom aren't our relatives. And we live in communities where we've moved because we want to go to the schools there, or what have you, and our neighbors are people we sort of meet at random, and we have as much or as little to do with each other as we choose. This is quite different from how people do things in the rest of the world. Let's see. I'm going to move away from this thing. I'm not compelled to do this in this way. Okay, so let's talk a little, and I'll also mention, let me just go back. It's interesting that the American people, when they get the chance, want to live in single-family units. And we managed to do it in the early days with the Northwest Ordinance, and then with the I'm forgetting what it's, jeez, I'm going senile. After the Civil War, they were trying to fill in the West, and they were giving away free land. Come on, help me. Homestead Act, gee whiz. Okay, right. And after America 2.0, people got crowded into cities. They were forced to live more communally. They didn't really like it that much. A lot of people didn't. And people who had any money would move out to the suburbs. I live in Oak Park, You take the green line or the blue line out to Oak Park. There's a picture, there was a centenary of Oak Park a few years ago. There's a picture taken from the tallest building in the looking east. It's grain fields all the way. People moving as far away from the dirty, dangerous slums full of foreigners as they could if they had any means, okay? Americans started building suburbs as soon as they had motor transport. The first suburbs were steamboats on the Hudson up away from Manhattan. And the rich people built houses along. They'd literally get in a boat and go to work, okay? So after the Second World War, we started to have a sort of new version of where the American absolute nuclear family is going to live, which was a suburban type of life. Now, what do we imagine this America in 2040 is going to be like? Well, we think that we'll find a new way to house the absolute nuclear family type of community that we have, and new types of employment are going to become available to us. And we obviously can't make a terribly accurate prediction of what's going to happen in the year 2040, which is in our book. If we could, we'd be investment advisors or doing it ourselves and not sharing our insights, but we don't have a crystal ball. What we are hoping to do, however, is not say the last word, but the first word. Because if we don't be thinking about where it's going to go and what the world our grandchildren are going to live in is going to be like, it won't be our idea. It won't be what we want. Someone else will substitute it for us. So we want to be thinking about what what is this background that we have, and what are the technological changes that we're going to experience going to open up to us as prospects, as possibilities. One big trend that we observed is self-employment is the growing sector of employment in America. Despite every legal impediment, the tax code, it's really, the government doesn't want us to live this way, but we're kind of being forced to. We think that trend is going to continue. I can mention in this room Ronald Coase, who was an economist at the University of Chicago, who died last year. He's about 102 and published a book when he was about 101, so he had a busy and active life. Ronald Coase asked a question around 1938 in a famous paper. He said, why do we have business firms anyway? Let's do our microeconomics and think, if we have perfect information and no transaction costs, why don't people get up every day, contract that day what they're going to do with whoever it's most productive to do it with, and not have firms? He said, well, you have firms because you have information scarcity, and it's hard to do that. You need to compile valuable information and valuable know-how and skill inside something and run that on a command economy type of basis. And what the internet permits us to do is live in a much more Coasean type of economy. It lets us work at gigs more than jobs. And one of the big changes that's going to happen is going to be really tough for people to handle, and we're not psychologically or institutionally prepared for, is the very idea of a job is kind of an America 2.0 phenomenon. 200 years ago, most people didn't have a job where you'd go to work for someone else, expect to be there for a long time. They owned the capital and the building, and they paid you something, and this was kind of it was not located in or near your home. This is all somewhat curious by historical standards, and we tend to think it's going to be dissolving. So one of the things we predict is that America 3.0 is going to be sort of like America 1.0, except super empowered. The productive capabilities that we're going to have are going to be immensely bigger than people had 200 years ago. Manufacturing, for example, we see 3D printers, and it's sort of funny, in the 6 months since we finished this book, some of the things we talked about have already moved along pretty rapidly. We talk about 3D printing and what's called clad manufacturing, which would be, and I didn't write it down. But anyway, point is that the factory floor is going to be everywhere. Manufacturing is not going to go away in the United States. And if you go on the internet, there's a very good video of Elon Musk, and he's doing a design of an object in 3 dimensions. You literally move it around as if you're touching it, and when you're done, you can print it. It's a metal rocket nozzle for a rocket. Okay, if you can. No, not everything's going to be doable this way, but you can do 3D printing of body parts. They'd be 3D printed a liver for a mouse that they put in the mouse. I mean, you're going to be able to grow a liver using your DNA if you need a new liver. I mean, some of the things that are happening are going to be very dramatic, okay? And it's not going to require thousands of people showing up at the factory gate like in 1913. And it's not going to require hundreds of people showing up to handle all the paperwork and processing things at a typing pool and with a mimeograph machine like in 1953. It's going to be quite a bit different. Exactly how this is going to play out, we don't know, but I do know that to the extent anyone tries to centrally direct it from Springfield to Washington, D.C., they're going to blow it. We need to facilitate people doing this on a voluntary and cooperative basis and let the creative powers of the American people come to the fore. Now, if you're really thinking about it, you're going to say, well, that's all great, but we have this horrible obstacle in our path. We have an existing government machine that doesn't want this to happen, that has incumbent businesses and connected people who want to keep things going the way they are and are going to try to thwart all these innovations. There's 2 responses to that, really. First, as I mentioned earlier, they can't meet its obligations. If something can't go on, it won't. So the government's going to fail. The existing government's going to fail to keep its obligations. It's going to default on them. And there's 2 ways that can happen. It can happen episodically and haphazardly in a way that really basically hurts the least protected, least connected people, the least politically astute people in our society. Or we can raise this issue as early as possible, force a resolution, what we call the big haircut in the book, and try to cash out these obligations in a way that's open and transparent and public so that people are hurt as little as possible by it. exactly how we do that. We've actually started to think about this. It probably require at least one constitutional amendment to do it, but the existing machinery isn't going to be able to extract the resources from society and give them back out again. That isn't going to work. So since it's going to fail, we need to be thinking about how to propose alternatives and how to couch those and turn them into laws and regulations that we can get passed to make this process as painless as possible, though it will be a painful process. Another thing, of course, is the state has a capacity to spy on us, control us, look at all of our information. We can't uninvent this. There's no way we can, there's no technological fix to what my friend Mark Safransky calls the creepy state. The creepy state can only be controlled by vigilant citizens passing laws that require people, the government, to not use these powers in an illegitimate fashion and impose serious penalties, imprisonment on people who violate that. And we've barely even gotten started. The American people have barely woken up to the fact that this is a problem. But that's the way that's going to have to be done. But I'm going to go to my last slide here. There we go. So what it really is we need to have a different mindset. We need to have a vision of the future based on a good understanding of the past and the nature of the present crisis. And I just saw this quote the other day. I thought it was great. There's a guy, Robert Lucas, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, Nobel laureate. He's an expert in development economics, economic development. And he's quoting one of my very favorite writers, V.S. Naipaul. And he was talking about how is it that that first transition was made? How was it that a world that was built on age-old, thousands of years old technology made this kind of escape to a industrial world, a world based on mechanical power and all the things that were associated with it? And he said, for income growth to occur in a society, a large fraction of people must experience changes in the possible lives they imagine for themselves and their children. And these new visions of possible futures must have enough force to lead them to change the way they behave, the hopes they invest in these children, the way they allocate their time. In the words of V.S. Naipaul, economic development requires 1 million mutinies. We have to be mutineers against the current regime. We need 1 million mutinies, each of us, through political activism, through how we operate our businesses, through the hope we have for the future, through telling our friends who've kind of given up and are in despair that they shouldn't be and they need to stop thinking like that and get with the program, okay? So I hope I have a room full of mutineers here with me to help build America 3.0. That's it for the moment. Does anyone have any questions? It's always hardest to get the first one. Bruno.
Not for me.
Not for you.
As always, is it not possible that your book is too optimistic? That while you have laid out a very good framework of all these possible positive things to happen, is it not also possible that over the decades of degrading knowledge, degrading drive, and inventiveness, we might only get 1,000 mutinies, we might only get 50, and the rest of the people just sit on their butt and let things happen the way they do, and that the United States of America actually still stagnates? And with that framework,
I don't just get to answer that, but go ahead. That's fine.
Well, so how does your optimism overcome that? How do you overcome that specific problem, other than just saying that you think we're going to do it?
Well, it's not. I hope it's more than just I'm saying that we're going to do it. People are relying on the existing model lasting forever, and most people have no conception of how bad things really are and how little money there is to pay these obligations. And when checks start to bounce, or you find your benefits whittled down to the point where they're worthless, or we have hyperinflation to pay people in degraded dollars, we're going to have a real problem on our hands. We'll have riots. Bad things will happen. We want to try to forestall that from happening. So the existing machinery isn't going to continue as it has. Now the question is, will they just kind of crack down and we'll become an authoritarian state, and we'll just get poorer and poorer and live in cardboard boxes, and it'll be like Peru or Ecuador, where 1% of the people drive by in armored limousines and the rest of the people live in shacks and cardboard boxes, right? This is a country full of people who are pretty well educated, pretty sophisticated, operate a high technology economy, are capable of organizing themselves, and I just don't think they're going to let it happen. But there's a further reason. What has always happened in American history is when you have a regime crisis, This is a structural feature of American history that happens by itself. Mass political movements arise. Slavery was intolerable, and people began to get organized to oppose it. And what happened is, what always happens with a mass political movement is the first wave of people are enthusiastic amateurs who look like kooks, but that's what has to happen to get things going. And then as the thing gets a little bit of momentum, you kind of call out the people who are actually capable of being political leaders, and more people adhere to it, and then you get the change. And that was what happened with the abolitionists. That's what happened with the progressives, who are kind of the bad guys in our narrative, but they did the best they could to solve the problems they had in front of them. The first people who were talking like that were considered to be utopian and crazy, and they got Franklin Roosevelt elected 4 times 2 generations later. Okay, so since we've managed to do that before, I think we'll manage to do it again. And actually, we're really kind of right on schedule, because I look at this and I see the Tea Party, I see other things, I see the beginnings of a mass political movement, right down to the enthusiastic amateurs who sometimes look like kooks, but many of whom have great ideas. And worst case, the government cracks down, the connected businesses use the power of the state to prevent things from happening the way we want. Solzhenitsyn said if you covered the whole world with cement, a crack would happen and a blade of grass would come through at some point, right? Okay, so eventually that model isn't going to work. Further, we're not alone in the world. Other people in other countries will take these technological developments and run with them, and we'll have to adapt to it, and we'll have to change. We'll have to have a political order that's capable of supporting that kind of economy. So it really is, how bad this is and how hard the process of change is kind of up to us. There is human agency. There's trends in history that are deep trends, but how they play out has a lot to do with who gets involved and what they do. The founding era of the USA, I read something like 3% of the people were very actively involved in the movement that led to the American Revolution. And they got about 30% of the people to be active supporters, 30% were loyalists, and about 40 just wanted nothing to do with it, just didn't want to get shot, right? 3% multiplied itself by 10, that was enough to change things. So 3% of 307 million people takes some effort, but that's not a hopeless cause. Anybody else got a question? Way back there.
I think you're trying to answer it, but I hear part of what you're talking about, that maybe political ideologies will not drive society, the movement of society, the direction that we evolve or that we move. But what you're saying at the same time is that there is a political component to this. What is going to be the conversion experience, the conversion moment for the politics that we're to see in the next 15, 20 years? And I'm thinking of I forget who said it, but we're all Marxists now to some extent. I mean, we all have a materialist dialectic that we see operating in the world, and it seems to still be actively determining on the policy issues. What principles, morals, what values, those are kind of fluff that are lost to people,
Okay.
but the people who are running things, I still believe that there are levers that are moved. Are these levers to be taken out of people's hands and given back to small organizations or individuals with initiative, or will they somehow accommodate each other?
What I wish I could say is that through efforts like the Heartland Institute, we'll educate so many people to how brilliant our ideas are and our vision of a free society is that they'll all just say, what was I thinking? And they'll vote in people who think like us, and that would be great. And there's always some of that. But I think that the main thing is the previous existing system has to be failing before people really realize it. The late 19th century, there was the progressives, but on the other side you had the populists who did everything they could to keep the agricultural farming economy alive, keep people on the farm, drive railroad rates down, and keep the farmer as he had been in small town America with its moral values the way it goes. There'll be opposition, okay? But I think that we're going to see the failure of this existing model become increasingly manifest to people. So the conversion moment is going to be when people, A, see this, what they've always thought was true isn't going to work. And B, when they see an alternative that's presented, okay? I see the Republicans opposing Obamacare. And they're seeing this as just this windfall. This is so great. We don't have to do anything. They hate the other guys. We can just sort of point at it and get elected. That's maybe good for one election. But to really be like Franklin Roosevelt, for our side and say, no, I'm gonna change this thing so much and take things so far, they can never put it back the way it was. Okay, we need to have alternative visions of how we want to do things.
So let's not Ronald Reagan was that person.
Well, you can't, let's not, politicians are never going to get us to utopia, right? We had, I'm old enough to remember the late 70s when I was a teenager. And, you know, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came in at a time when things were really bad. And they got us about a generation of pretty good growth, and we had the explosion of the internet economy. We won the Cold War. Some good things happened, but okay. We keep trying to exhume poor Ronald Reagan because he gets to lie down. He's like, I did what I could. It's your turn, right? Can't you guys generate another Ronald Reagan? Gee whiz, right? He said, I read Hayek and that stuff and, you know, worked for me. Have at it. Okay.
One of the things that I've been reading about in the news is the demise of the job, and that's been talked about. But the concerns are corporate, scientific, and defense secrets moving faster than they currently are today, and that's our lead in the world. So as you bring on more people diving in, security has been an afterthought, unfortunately, in this country, in many unfortunate situations.
Right.
So how would that be addressed? Because I understand that's on the horizon.
Okay, well, I think there will still be very large businesses in terms of their revenue and the value of the intellectual property they have,
Exactly.
but they may not have very large permanent workforces. Military type manufacturing may be the last thing to really change. I mean, you probably can't build an aircraft carrier or a large submarine that carries hundreds of UAVs that's going to, you know, be used to deter the Chinese or something, you know, with a 3D printer. And that'll be one of the. But however, on the work site, as they're making particular parts or repairing things, they may be using all this technology, right? Now, preserving secrecy, and that raises a whole set of very interesting questions. What if it's possible to encrypt your information so that it's really difficult to crack it, so that the NSA would have to work really hard? And what if that type of encryption becomes ubiquitous and we can all send our information around securely? How are they going to collect the taxes? There's a novel by a guy named Neil Stephenson called The Diamond Age, which was a big influence on us. His prediction in that book is cheap, hard encryption happens, the government can't tell what anybody's doing, everyone stops paying their taxes, they all go broke, civilization falls apart, and they rebuild it on the rubble. It's a pretty good book. But anyway, as far as keeping secrets goes, is you have to have policy, you have to vet people. I mean, if they think that just we're going to save money by not paying rent in a place where people have their desks, they're going to have to set up their own office in their basements, and that saves us money, and not take into consideration the security and secrecy and trade secret issues. You know, businesses are going to have to adapt to this new world too and do the things they need to do. Do you have a follow-up? Yeah, real quick.
Well, I'm sure Rose gets a chance to say something, but I totally agree with you. The one thing that we probably do as a country is be very careful about the back doors that are plugged into the security encryption chips in this country that basically make it all visible, because if we can do it, other people can see it.
We have a whole chapter on security and defense, but anyway, yes, ma'am.
I don't know how much you know about Common Core, but this is what I'm most fearful of. If we don't get rid of it somehow, and it's taking hold in the United States, although there are lots of states who are really trying to reject it. But I studied the Common Core, and they have textbooks that really teach the children not to love the United States. The Gettysburg Address, it's how they feel about it. They don't teach the other or what is behind it, or the truths. They don't deal with memorization anymore, so they don't know dates, they don't know history, they don't know that. And they're teaching a whole new generation, knowing that if they plant the seeds early in the young, as they are doing now or wish to, they're going to have a whole new adult class which will adapt socialism, and they're brought up that way and they don't know the difference, and they feel that's great, so it's going to be very, very difficult to change.
So socialism isn't going to be on the table if there's no money. So they can believe it's a lovely idea, but they're going to have a real problem on their hands.
Maybe, but their mindset will be as
Well,
such.
you know what? I agree with you, and I'll say further. This has been going on for a really long time. Okay, Common Core is just the latest iteration of this sort of thing. I mean, I talk to people, and if you like history and you read it and you follow things up, you find that most people don't know anything. You know, if you ask people, tell me who was on what side in the Second World War, just the major players. People who are, adult people with real jobs, they're like, I don't know, we fought the Germans, so it's us the Germans, the British were in there, I think they were on our side. It's not that good. So on the one hand, you can say, well, this is terrible, they're all brainwashed, but I wonder how much any of them are listening anyway. But let me, not to be flippant, I think that what we're going to see, though, is this is another huge issue that's fascinating, is the two real America 2.0 calcified, terrible parts of our economy are education and healthcare. The two the government is deeply embedded in, right?
Yes.
And both of those, especially education, are already starting to crumble from without because people have alternatives. I mean, the alternatives in education, you have Khan Academy, you can get lectures by the best people in the world, you can find someone to tutor you with in math who's awake in the middle of the night in Bangalore, India, who speaks English just as well as you, and he goes on the whiteboard on your computer and you do the problem together. And we're at the first moments of this sort of thing. So to the extent that the public schools are failing people, what I think will happen is it won't be that they'll all wake up, get politically organized, close them, do a money follows the child approach like we'd like to see. But I think enough people are going to opt out and be doing other things and seeing better alternatives that they're paying for, and they're paying twice. And then we'll start to see people say, wait a second, tell me again why I'm paying twice for this and why I'm paying for the public schools when I'm doing this with my own kids on the side. But the thing is, intellectually you need to build an alternative case, but I think it's really business opportunities for people to build alternatives to that public education system, and that's what's going to undermine
But
it.
progressivism, I think, came at the same time education changed, because during World War I and II, we did produce educated people who were able to go out in the world. But then something changed, I think, with progressivism, with big government and everything else came in, and those people with those ideas kind of took over education too.
They did, and
I remember those times in a sense, I'm older than you, and I can remember the 1940s and 50s and what have you.
well, they won that
education
round,
was
but
good, and it wasn't
there's no. It's not like a movie where the credits roll. The English-speaking people have been around for 1,500 years, and will be around for 1,500 more. And this is a phase in the life of the English-speaking people and the American people, and we'll have to just overcome this problem. I think it is doable.
But it's disturbing.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Your optimism seems to be running counter to a lot of stuff I'm reading in the press.
No
There's a book
surprise.
out which I haven't read called The Great Stagnation. There's an
Tyler
article-
Cowen.
Yeah, right. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and they all seem to have the same theme,
Uh-huh.
that America and the world is due for slower economic growth, the labor force is declining, productivity is declining, the quality of the workforce, education is declining.
Yeah, doom
And they-
sells. Doom
Right,
sells.
Right, and so what's your...
And it's a get-out-of-jail-free card, right? You can play the role of the wise and world-weary sage and sit in your cozy chair and say, we're doomed. It was good once, but there's no hope. No, I don't think so, okay? Things look awfully bad in Eastern Europe in 1985, and people managed to bestir themselves and get rid of the communists. And things looked awfully bad in the 1930s when the entire Eurasian landmass, including most of Europe, had dictatorships, and we beat them and changed that. And things looked, awfully bad at any number of times in history. Tyler Cowen is a good writer, and he says, this is astonishing to me. He says, we've picked all the low-hanging fruit. We're not going to have economic advance like we used to because all the easy stuff is done. People have said this over and over again. Famously said this at the turn of the 19th century, well, there's nothing left to invent. And John Maynard, what's his name? Not John Maynard Keynes. Kenneth Galbraith in the 60s said the same thing. We have a mature economy, so we won't really... This is like when the DARPA net was just getting started, the first seedlings of the internet. He was completely wrong. The question is, why is growth slowing? Are the creative powers of the American people evaporated? I'm sure that's wrong. My co-author kind of came up through the high-tech world in California. He was friends with all these visionary-type entrepreneurs. And they will tell you there's all kinds of great ideas parked on the sideline waiting for the regulatory and tax regime to improve. And we're not going to risk our money and get picked clean and go nowhere. You go on like Wired, which is a website that's kind of a pop technology and science website. There's the stuff that's coming along that's at the lab scale is unbelievably great in medicine. Like we talk about driverless cars in the book. I didn't even realize when I wrote it it was as far along as it is. That the Mercedes-Benz company, to celebrate 150th anniversary or something, had a drive that the original founder had done like 100 kilometers or something, and they did it with the driver sitting with his hands folded in his lap, and it stopped at the lights and stopped for people crossing the street. Okay, if we don't need to be operating our cars, we can work in them, we can sleep in them. You want to make an overnight trip? The cars will change shape. You get to work, it drops you off, it parks itself. Okay, so I mean, things like this are going to liberate us, all right, in a lot of different ways, and they'll create new problems. They'll shut down whole categories of jobs, and those people will be on the street. What's going to happen to them? That's another thing people always say, well, this all sounds great, but then everyone's going to starve to death because there won't be any jobs. Except, you know, if you ask the founders in 1776, you know, if you told them, you know, 125, 150 years, 60% of the people won't be engaged in farming and growing food. So how in the heck can you know, how can that be? You know, what will they be doing? Well, they'll be operating railroads and in factories and Bessemer converters, steel mills, and well, steel, huh? You know, steel you just use for surgical instruments and weapons because it's really expensive. No, we'll build skyscrapers out of it and cover the whole continent with steel railroad tracks. You couldn't have dreamed of it, okay? So people are creative and people are assets, and the obstacle to that is the regulatory regime, the government power we have, crony capitalism where incumbent businesses take advantage of the regulatory and tax machinery to thwart competition. Those are the obstacles. That's what has to go.
A comment and then a question. The underlying flaw of progressivism with this wealth redistribution is it makes the assumption that, you know, the pie is fixed. And, you know, like you said, there's no more economic growth. Well, the contrary to that is, as you pointed out, is human creativity has little to no limits on it. As long as you have that, you will have the possibility to expand the pie in new technologies and so forth. My question, though, is Charles Murray, in his book, Coming Apart, makes the point that he thinks that at least middle-class white families are no longer sharing the values they used to have, and that is a problem that's affecting the entire society, and values are coming down. You're getting more whites having children out of wedlock and so forth. How does all of that play into it? Because your book depends on two things: it's human nature. You know, that's the basic thing.
Okay, well, predicting economic and political changes is hard enough. Predicting moral and spiritual changes is really hard, almost probably impossible. God Almighty knows when those things are going to happen, okay? Murray points to a couple of interesting things. He says, well, one, the people farther down the income spectrum are kind of abandoning a lot of traditional moral arrangements, but kind of because it's a safety net of government spending. If that goes away, you know, one of the reasons the moral values people have lived by for centuries are there is because they work. Because if you don't have, you know, two spouses to take care of a kid, you're going to starve, okay? And if you prop up bad behavior, you're going to get more bad behavior. If the prop goes away, people are going to have to make a painful personal reform, right? Also, it's interesting that the wealthy people in this country don't preach what they practice. They stay married. They devote a huge amount of effort to their kids. They try to live in places that are going to be good for their families. They try to associate with other people like them, but they don't want to kind of tell anyone else to do that, okay? In England in 1800, and it was still the world of Samuel Hogarth and gin lane, and gin was like crack. It was dirt cheap, and people were killing themselves. And you couldn't walk in safety across London in broad daylight, okay? And they decided to change. John Wesley started the Methodist movement, and the Anglican Church wasn't doing anything, and you have these revival meetings with 10,000 people at them. I don't know how he made himself heard, but he must have had lungs like you dream about. And people said, there were rarely just straight line trends in history, right? And the moral changes in society, people say, we're here, and it's bad, and it's going to get to this. But maybe not. A generation can say, my parents and grandparents really followed this up. And you get a John Wesley, or you get a John Hughes, Cardinal Archbishop of New York, who had, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of Irish, really, refugees. The people who had any money in their pocket kept going. And they went to places like Cincinnati and Chicago and St. Louis where you could make a living. And he had illiterate people, out of wedlock births, orphans sleeping on the sidewalk, didn't know who their parents were. And he got going. And he got people to volunteer. He had all these nuns who were thrown out of Europe after the revolutions in 1848. They'd show up in New York, didn't speak English. You're school teachers, ladies. I just bought this Protestant church where, because everyone had ran away from the Irish so they wouldn't get their throat cut, I got it at the bankruptcy auction. So we're going to start a school. And he literally walked down the street and grabbed these kids and bring them to places where they were teaching them trades and so on. And I'm sure every day if you looked at him, what he did made sense, but at the end of it was heroic. It was frankly it was miraculous, okay? I'll go there and say that at the possibly atheistic Ayn Rand influenced Heartland Institute. But, to the extent we're part of the million mutineers, that's part of what we have to do. We have to be willing to make that moral transformation happen. You need saints and you need people who are going to have moral values and assert them. Maybe that's going to be you. Who knows?
This sounds like Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point.
I don't know.
Would you consider running for political office to help drive some of the changes? Hoping for?
If I had any assurance that if I stopped doing productive legal work, more than I've already done to do this, and my kids won't starve to death, I'll consider anything, okay? But that's really the break, yeah.
What types of sources did you draw on to write that chapter about America 2040?
Geez, what would we draw on? Well, let me back up. Jim Bennett, my co-author, and I have been corresponding with each other at least once a day for about 12 years. And, like I said, he comes out of that tech world, and it's just a huge amount of articles and things that have come across our path as we've gone. I may cite to a few things in the back of the book. But it's funny because I try to just kind of keep track of the things I see on a day-to-day basis. It's like, this stuff's accumulating all the time.
Well, that was the technological stuff, but what about, you mentioned that, states will start to form new regional alliances and things like that.
Yeah, the idea that if you have a state that's insolvent, break it up. Make California into 3 states. We've done it 4 times. Maine and Massachusetts were broken up. West Virginia was broken off of Virginia. Kentucky and Virginia were broken up. And there's a 4th one. Vermont was carved out of New Hampshire and New York. So, Jim in another publication uses the phrase, he says, this Lockean bargains and Burkean sentiments. Okay, John Locke says, we make deals to arrange our affairs and create a social contract and so on. And you look at the American map, right? You have square states, right? Someone cut a deal. That was a negotiating process, right? But then, as time goes by, people start to have sentiment for it. I'm a Hoosier and I support the IU basketball team, right? So these things kind of take on the sort of Burkean life of their own, but they're not permanent, right? And the idea that it's unambiguously the case that very productive societies, very productive communities tend to be small. The great economic powerhouses of history were city-states, right? Venice, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Holland, London. The USA, the peculiar genius of the USA was by making this whole continent into a loose federation of lots of small communities that didn't have a heavy hand at the top. We got all the benefits of all this dynamism, but the defense and free trade benefits of being a large unit. That's going the way we've been going for the last 50 years, is to lose a big part of what makes us work. Yes, sir.
Thoughts of what you see Detroit looking like in 10 years?
I'm sorry?
What Detroit look like in 10 years?
Depends on what they do.
Well,
Well, let's think about that, right? Detroit could basically be paved over and abandoned in 10 years. Or you could do what somebody proposed, which just basically use eminent domain, take a lot of these neighborhoods that have very few people living in them, evict them, pay them for their property, bulldoze it, shut off all the city services, and de-incorporate it.
They're doing that. They're turning it into farmland.
Yeah, okay. So, but here's the thing. Detroit had a rationale that's no longer there. And instead of aggressively having city fathers and civic spirit to say, what, the auto industry's kind of peaking, what other stuff can we bring in here to keep this thing going? Chicago was a lot better at that, but Chicago was a more diverse economy in the first place. But the big problem, Detroit is exactly ultra-pathological case of the America 2.0 model completely failing, right? Is the big business, big government, big labor, take over, run things in their own interest, and it seems to work for a while. And, it ultimately failed. So what I hope they'll do up there is, like we said, shed the obligations they can no longer keep and find a reason to attract people to stay there and work there. Apparently the outer ring of suburbs are doing pretty well too. So it's not like the whole region is a lunar craterscape, okay? I mean, it's just the downtown city. And you have minorities who live in neighborhoods that are not policed. You got to impose public order first, right? So those things need to happen. But yeah, Detroit's a scary example.
What do you see happening in Chicago and Illinois? So I just read where leader and elected officials are 43,000. We have 8,000 taxing districts. We have 800 school districts. Do you see this socialism trend leveling off, or do you think it'll go on for years? We can borrow more money. What do you see
Illinois
happening in Chicago and Illinois?
Illinois is the worst governed state in the union, probably. Or it's in the bottom, certainly the bottom 5. We have the lowest bond rating in the country. It's shedding businesses. Everyone you talk to is like, how do I get out of here? I have a law license here. I have 1 foot nailed to the floor. I don't know how I move. But my wife's a Democrat. She said, we should leave the state. I said, I'll do it if you promise me one thing. Never vote for a Democrat again. Because you destroyed one state already, and I don't want to go help destroy another one. But Illinois is a perfect example. Illinois can't pay its bills. And what they've decided to do is the people who are powerful in Springfield are going to write the law so that the people who are already beneficiaries are going to be priority creditors over police, fire, schools, emergency, roads, people with disabilities. And they'll just literally move out of state and get their check there and try to insert the people here who can't leave. So it's long overdue for a revolt here. And if there's anything you need to have a vision of the future to change people, it's that. Why do people submit to this here? I don't know. It's sort of like Václav Havel said about Eastern Europe. He says everyone's so beaten down they don't want to say anything. He said during communism, he said if everyone in Czechoslovakia for one day had just told the truth about everything instead of lying to themselves and to each other, the whole thing would have fallen down. We need to have that happen in this state. And you need to have activists, and you need to have people to take the lead. I know people who are trying to do this. I'm working with people who are trying to do this. And it's a steep hill. But this is a great state. I mean, there's no reason Illinois shouldn't be one of the economic powerhouses of the world. We have an educated workforce. We're the transportation hub of the biggest economy in the world. We have great universities. We have subsurface wealth. We have farms. We have a diverse economy. The only problem with this state is self-inflicted political incompetence, corrupt politics, and rotten policy. And the bill that's going to have to be paid to clear all that out of the way is going to be awful. But the sooner we start, the better. Okay. Dan.
That kind of leads to, I think, a critical question, Mike, which is, one fact that's not discussed as much in your presentation is the absolute lust for power on the part of some people who basically have nothing other than that. The evil, of people who want to control other people to that extent.
Yeah.
Now with the technology and the power that they have, and with the corrupt media that's pretty much bought by them, they can do what they did in the Soviet Russia, which was an agricultural powerhouse, the most religious nation in Europe, by force put into an totalitarian atheistic state. There's examples that can be multiplied throughout history. What do we do about stopping people who have now more access to power and desire to create, using all kinds of false rationalizations, a totalitarian type state under various guises?
Well, the Russians and the Americans are pretty different in a lot of ways. And the American people have not ever, with the exception of Negro slavery, not lived under that type of tyrannical regime and have never tolerated it and have tended to resist before it's fully installed. I also think the basic model that these guys are promoting is failing before our eyes, and that's going to be hard. They're not going to have credibility. If a regime has credibility, they can do all kinds of things and people will just accept it. But when it's not working and it's visibly not working, it's a lot harder. Why we have a news media that dominates our life that is completely in bed with one political orientation is kind of a mystery to me. I don't know why people with money and means don't build an alternative and make money selling that product, but I don't know. That I don't know. I also think, like I said, I think we're seeing the beginnings of a political movement against what we have now, and I hope we can encourage that and keep it going. I wish I had a better answer for you, like, oh, didn't I mention that one? I forgot that one slide that has the magic key to our problem. Geez, what happened to that? I don't. But I just think that the current situation we're in opens up both opportunities and really bad concerns. We need to seize the opportunities, Mike.
Yeah, kind of wrapping all of this up.
Good idea, because yours is probably the last question.
We've all heard the saying, prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
Right.
Even though it may get worse before it gets better, don't we also need to prepare for the best?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, history's unwritten, right? Jesus Christ himself said, I don't know when I'm coming back. Only my Father in heaven knows. If he doesn't know what's going to happen, we don't know what's going to happen. Okay? And look, the American founders were rolling the dice. They'd all been hanged. The British, they'd have hanged those guys. And they rolled the dice and they made it happen. George Washington was a pretty big guy. He'd have been a major player in American life if we'd have stayed loyal to the crown. Instead, he rolled the dice and risked his life. Okay? None of us, I think, are in a position right now we're going to have to risk our lives to become politically active and make things happen. I hope it doesn't ever get to that point. It's still possible to win elections and change things. It's still possible to be an election. Here's something. Everyone could volunteer to be a Republican election judge, sit there all day and prevent vote fraud in Cook County. It happens all the time, and they probably won't do it if you're sitting there. That matters. There's a lot of stuff we can do. But yeah, we need to start thinking, what would we like it to be like? And what's a plausible future we want to have, and start aiming at that rather than just be fighting against Barack Obama and this absurdity of people like him. That's it.